Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Was World War I Pointless? War Goals of Every Major Nation by the Great War. Now this is an interesting question, right? You often hear the First World War framed as if it was this great fruitless effort. Was that actually the case? Well, not to be pedantic, but it does sort of depend on what you mean by pointless, right? Of course, the war happened for a variety of reasons, and the different nations and people involved in the conflict had different things they hoped to get out of it. Some of those people succeeded, many did not. What I would say is that the amount of life lost due to this conflict means that any potential advantages or gains were absolutely not worth it, right? So that's how I would sort of answer the question of was the war pointless, right? The loss of life meant that really nothing you got out of the war was worth it. But in this video, we'll get to talk about what these different nations were hoping to achieve and whether they managed to or not. Now, if you guys end up enjoying this one, I would appreciate it if you'd leave a like on the video, subscribe to my channel, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
The First World War is often seen as futile and pointless. Millions of men fought and died for years, but no one was satisfied with the outcome, which did not bring a lasting peace.
Yeah, I think you'll often hear it said that millions of men fought and died for nothing. Now, I don't think that is exactly true. Like I said in the intro, there were lots of reasons that this war happened. Now, they may not have necessarily been good reasons, but they were reasons. And of course, there were outcomes. You know, some nations and people even had some more positive outcomes than others, but what I would say is that millions of men fought and died for a variety of goals that were not really worth it. You know what I mean? In the end, the loss of life, it was so major that really any achievement that came out of the war was not even close to justifying the amount of death that came along with it.
But that is not how governments and many people saw the war as it was being fought. So what did the countries fighting actually want to achieve? In other words, what was the purpose of the First World War? To understand why the First World War was fought, we have to look at the war aims of the great powers who fought it.
Yeah, and honestly, to even ask what was the purpose of the war is maybe a bit too much of a general question, because, like I sort of pointed at in the intro, and as they're sort of picking up here, all of the different countries involved in this war had different goals and got into it for different reasons, right? So there wasn't one reason this war started. It did not have one singular purpose. It had many different purposes. There were many different reasons it started, which is why this is, more of an in-depth question than you might expect.
War aims are the political, ideological, or economic goals a government decided it wanted to achieve or defend by fighting. Sometimes the powers change their war aims depending on the course of the war, internal debates, or reactions to enemy war aims. We should also remember World War I was a war between states. Governments decided to go to war, and why? Not banks, arms manufacturers, or other interest groups. Ideologically, most powers saw—
Yes, though I think you can make the argument that a lot of those interest groups had influence, sometimes behind the scenes, sometimes right out in the open, right? Of course, this was a war of different states, but within each of those states, there were different interest groups, often interest groups with a lot of money and power, who had influence on how the war was run, how things operated.
Themselves as fighting for virtuous ideals like civilization, freedom, and culture against enemies representing barbarism or soulless materialism. Some have argued that these ideas were the most important war aims of all. We fight not to destroy a nation, but to kill a nest of ideas. The ultimate purpose of this war is propaganda, the destruction of certain beliefs, and the creation of others. So, bearing that in
mind, I wouldn't necessarily agree with that. I would say that the propaganda was really in service of perpetuating the war, right? A lot of these nations pumped out propaganda suffused with ideology and moralism, I think, in large part, to convince or keep convinced the population of their countries to keep fighting, to sign up, and to further support the war. Right? That's what I'd say about the propaganda of the First World War. And that's not to say that nobody believed in any sort of ideological causes. Plenty of people did. But I think that the propaganda pushing a lot of those causes was really in service of continuing or supporting the war effort in different countries.
Let's start with the Central Powers. When Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia in July 1914, it just wanted a local war to weaken Serbia.
Yeah, I'd say they did not succeed, right? Austria was pursuing its interests in the region, right? It still felt it was the big dog of the region of the Balkans, especially as the Ottoman Empire was receding pretty badly at this point. Austria wanted to further extend its influence. It wanted this local war to punish Serbia. That's essentially what they were going for. And instead, they got a global war, which broke up their empire, right? So Austria definitely did not succeed in its initial goals.
Some had long argued for this, while others, like Franz Ferdinand himself, were opposed. Even if we settled the score with Serbia without anyone troubling us, what would we gain from it? A band of thieves, assassins, bandits, and a few plum trees. But in July 1914, he was gone. Vienna decided that reducing Serbia would preserve its great power status and prevent the Serbs from acquiring Albania or menacing Bosnia in the future.
And Austria was, they were both sort of trying to be opportunistic, right? Like I said, taking advantage of both Ottoman decline in the region and sort of chaos that had erupted between these different Balkan powers who were newly autonomous or independent. But Austria was also worried about its position being weakened by all of these new Balkan powers, new competitors in the region. Of course, in this case, we're talking about Serbia in particular. They were worried about a sort of greater Serbia emerging from all of this. So Austria, through sort of combination of fear for its own position and sort of greed or ambition, gets into this conflict.
War became generalized, the Austrians debated territorial aims, like the annexation or vassalization of Serbia, though there was no agreement on this, the preservation of the border with Italy, and the possibility of creating a Central Powers-friendly Poland. Some politicians also wanted parts of Albania or Montenegro. Foreign Minister Ottokar Czernin, for example, hoped that if Austria allowed Germany a free hand with Poland, it might get territory from Romania and a free hand in the Balkans. As the situation in the war worsened, Vienna also aimed to maintain its independence since Germany had taken control of most military decisions. By late 1917, Austria-Hungary had, in a way, won its war. Serbia had been crushed, Russia was all but out of the war, and Italian forces were on the defensive deep inside Italy.
In a way, but in another way, this war went worse for them than they ever could have imagined.
But the dual monarchy's government, economy, and society were approaching collapse.
Yeah.
It had also become dependent on and subservient to Germany, which represented a failure to preserve its prestige and power.
That's a big one, right? Austria had been one of the European great powers for a long time. They had a well-established pedigree, though of course they were sort of in decline or they stagnated in recent times. Whereas you compare them to Germany, now the state of Germany itself at this point was only a couple of decades old, so that's really new on the scene. But even the predecessor to modern Germany, which was Prussia, was still one of the newer of these European great powers, right? It had really established itself in the 18th century, and of course it was only that next century that Prussia, through its own and a bunch of other German states' efforts, was able to establish an independent Germany, right? And so at this point, the upstart, the sort of younger sibling, had become the more powerful of the two, right? Austria had been broken up through this war. They had been greatly weakened in Germany, though of course World War I does not end well for Germany, right? They are weakened and all of that sort of stuff, though they recover in the long run. Germany is clearly the senior partner in this relationship. They've been able to establish a pretty clear domination over Austria. a domination that will continue into the future.
The final year of the war, Emperor Karl aimed for a white peace, and to preserve the state by making concessions to the empire's Slavic peoples. Austria-Hungary, of course, achieved none of what it intended when it started the war in 1914. The war aims of its ally Germany, on the other hand, are perhaps the most hotly debated of all. One argument is that Germany long planned on starting a war before Russia got too strong, and then took advantage of the July crisis to make a bid for world power in 1914. And in the war's early days, Kaiser Wilhelm and the High Command talked of annexing Russian Poland, the Baltics, Belgium, and northern France.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of discussion and debate about every aspect of this conflict. You know, especially with World War I, there's a lot of complexity, a lot of shifting motives over time. You know, when we look, say, at World War II, which of course is an incredibly complex war in its own right, the motivations are a little more clear. Say you're talking about Nazi Germany, there's some things you can pin down a bit more definitively. Of course, there are always a lot of reasons and motivations that go into any decision. Whereas World War I, even though in the Treaty of Versailles, the blame for the war is placed on Germany, is actually a lot more difficult to assign responsibility and blame for this conflict. It really can be spread around to a lot of different countries and actors, which makes this pretty complicated when you're talking about why did this war begin? Who was pushing for this? Why did they want to begin the war? What were the different reasons that went into this? What was the true motivation of all these different historical actors involved? Right? That's a complicated question.
But other historians argue German politicians were more moderate. A fall 1914 policy document known as the September Program discussed possible annexations, satellite states, and more land in Africa, but it also left these questions open. The program also envisioned a future Mitteleuropa.
Well, I think what you'll find in Germany is that, you know, there was a sort of division between, and this division would persist throughout Weimar Germany, you know, for the worse. There was this division between civilian governance and the sort of military infrastructure or the military hierarchy of the German state, right? Of course, Germany, even under the Kaiser, had a civilian government, but there was a lot of power contained within the German military. It had a lot of ability to plan on its own, not necessarily to make decisions on its own, but to push affairs in one way or another, right? There's a lot of authority there. And like I said, that division continued into Weimar Germany, when of course you had a civilian government that was simultaneously more all-encompassing than it was under the Kaiser, but also in some ways weaker, right? And you had a sort of resurgent military that was growing over time, and, you know, you've got political radicalism, all that sort of stuff. That's looking forward a little bit. But when you're looking at the decision makers of pre-war Germany, yes, you're looking at civilian politicians, but you're looking at the Kaiser. Importantly, you're looking at military leaders, right? And they did not all have the same motivations and the same viewpoints on everything.
A German-dominated customs union. German leaders discussed whether the union would include Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Belgium, or perhaps even France, Italy, and the Netherlands as well. Mitteleuropa was an economic goal on the surface, but was really about German dominance in Europe. As the war dragged on, German leaders divided further. Some favored a negotiated, compromise peace, a Scheidemann peace, while others stuck to maximalist aims, a Hindenburg peace. Chief of Staff Erich von Falkenhayn's aim was modest. If we survive against this coalition of superior strength and emerge able to negotiate credibly, we will have won.
And we see, even within the military, there are different perspectives. And of course, as World War I continued, the military became more and more powerful until, by the end of the war, you're almost dealing with more of a military state than a state governed by civilians, which, you know, is not that rare for a wartime governance. But just to make the point, the military became more powerful. And of course, within the military, you had people with different aims, goals, and perspectives.
Berlin did make a peace offer in December 1916, though Germany refused to evacuate the occupied territories, showing Berlin still hoped for extensive gains from the war. The Reichstag then voted for a peace resolution in July 1917 that gave up on annexing territory. By then, though, Germany had become a virtual military dictatorship where the high command held more sway than the parliament.
Exactly.
The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, a dictated peace signed with Bolshevik Russia in 1918, fulfilled Germany's war aims in the east. Germany indirectly controlled Finland, Ukraine, the Baltics, and Poland, and maintained occupation forces. The treaty crippled Russia, gave Germany control of Eastern Europe's resources, and, politicians hoped, could be used as a tool in future negotiations with the Allies.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like, and it was an immediate boon when it happened, but of course, those gains were not maintained over time, and that dynamic between Germany and Russia was also not maintained, as Soviet Russia consolidated and grew more powerful over time. They became, as we can see through the Second World War, a serious threat to German ambitions.
Even in summer 1918, many German military leaders still called for annexations in the West. In the fall, with the army in full retreat, the civilian government hoped to salvage what it could by embracing Wilsonian self-determination to avoid losing territory. So German goals did indeed trend towards European dominance. Ironically, partly because of the harshness of Brest-Litovsk, the Allies took a harder line. Meanwhile, Germany's Ottoman ally had much more limited aims.
Yeah.
The Ottoman Empire joined the war in October 1914, and its aims were shaped by its relative weakness after defeats in recent wars.
Yeah, the Ottomans were struggling, man. They were not out to conquer Europe like the Germans were, and like the Ottomans themselves had once tried to do hundreds of years ago. They were now fighting in many ways for their survival, to consolidate what they already had, right? They were a pretty rapidly declining state that had lost a lot of power over time and a lot of influence.
The Sultan's government reasoned that if they stayed neutral, whoever won the war could impose their will on an isolated Constantinople. The Slavic world is growing more rapidly than its neighbors. A strong Ottoman state must form an alliance with Germany and take a defensive position against the Russian and Balkan Slavs. Politicians were divided as to which side to join, but the leaders of the governing Committee of Union and Progress chose the Central Powers because they considered the Allies a greater threat. The Russian Empire wanted to conquer their capital, and the French and British had imposed one-sided economic treaties in the past.
Yeah, I mean, if you're looking at it from the Ottoman perspective, of course, in the end, they sort of bet on the wrong side, right? They were really just looking out for their own self-interest. That's why they decided to go with the Central Powers. Did not help them in the end. But their decision does make sense, because who were the greatest threats to the Ottoman Empire? The Russians, the British, and the French. Russia had really stripped the Ottomans of a lot of their territory. Most of it not even absorbed by Russia itself, but Russia had helped to fight for the autonomy and independence of a lot of these Balkan states, who were, many of them, Orthodox Christian states, who felt some allegiance to Russia, both perhaps in terms of religion, but also just the geopolitical situation, right? So Russia had forced the Ottomans out of a lot of their territory at this point. They had been if not the great rival of the Ottomans for a while when the war broke out. Then you've got the British and the French, who were a little less interested in territorial domination of the empire, though still interested in it. Maybe they weren't less interested in it. But really the biggest threat from the British and the French was political and economic domination. The Brits and the French had in many ways dominated the Ottoman economy, the Ottoman banking industry, different productive industries of the Ottoman Empire, like tobacco, for instance. I mean, they held a massive amount of sway over Ottoman political and economic life, right? And so, because of all those reasons, the Ottomans saw the Entente powers as the biggest threat to them. And they're probably right, but of course, in the end, they sided with the losing team.
Holding off the Russians and canceling the economic capitulations would restore the empire's full independence. Given the political unrest the empire had suffered before 1914 and surging Turkish nationalism, the government also used the war to achieve its internal aim of state consolidation. This included repressions that mostly targeted Christian Greeks and especially Armenians.
And I mean, this is, of course, this trend has been happening for a while, but what we're seeing is the transformation of the Ottoman Empire into modern day Turkey. The transformation of what had once been a massive multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire that, of course, it's not like they were as tolerant as we would like today, but compared to a lot of other medieval empires, especially in Europe, there was relative toleration within the Ottoman Empire of Jews and Christians and different religious groups, was transforming from that, and it had been for some time, into this very nationalistic modern nation state, right? Turkey, a nation state like many other European nation states. Germany is a good example, for instance. So we're seeing that transformation really kick into high gear with the First World War, where, like they said, the government was taking this as an opportunity to rapidly and often violently achieve some of those political goals.
The deportation and killing of much of these populations, in the eyes of the government, made the empire a more stable, Muslim-dominated state. After battlefield successes in...
And of course, part of it, the shift away from that multi-ethnic empire, are the actions of the Ottoman and Turkish state, as we're shifting into modern Turkey. But a big part of it is just that they had lost most of their Balkan territory. They had already lost a lot of their Jewish and Christian subjects, right? They simply just didn't control the territory anymore. And so it was already becoming an empire, a state that was more and more dominated by one particular religion and one particular ethnicity.
1915, the Russian Revolution, and the Greek entry on the Allied side in 1917, Constantinople formed territorial goals as well. They wanted the northeastern regions lost to Russia in 1877, which they briefly did recover after Brest-Litovsk, Aegean Islands to protect the Dardanelles, and to recover Egypt and Tripolitania from Britain and Italy. They also planned to increase Ottoman influence in the Caucasus, Iran, and Afghanistan, although Germany was uneasy with this objective. The Ottomans failed to preserve their empire, but paradoxically, they did consolidate their state, which contributed to a post-war Turkish republic. Now let's turn to the...
Yeah, it's sort of an interesting case where, much like Austria, this war led to the collapse of their empire, right? The Ottoman Empire collapsed. But unlike Austria, which was still quite weakened following the First World War, I mean, of course, Turkey was as well, but what emerged from the corpse of the Ottoman Empire was actually a Turkish state that was more centralized and was better able to control its own affairs, oftentimes to the detriments of the residents of the empire and state, right? The Armenian genocide, for example, right? So I'm not saying this was a positive moral change, but the state really was a bit more capable following the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. And, of course, maybe this would have happened perhaps in a different way had this war not happened, but it's sort of difficult to set up that counterfactual. This is how the Ottomans did come to an end.
Allies, starting with the Russian Empire. One of St. Petersburg's aims in 1914 was maintaining its great power prestige after defeat in the Russo-Japanese War, the Revolution of 1905, and a diplomatic defeat in Austria-Hungary's annexation of Bosnia in 1908. Russian leaders felt they couldn't afford to back down over Serbia in 1914, even though the High Command worried that the army wasn't ready for a general war.
Well, right, and I mentioned that Russia had really been one of, if not the Ottomans' greatest enemies in stripping territory away from them, both directly, as we saw, but also indirectly through these new Balkan states. But now Russia is worrying about their position weakening, because you see the influence of, say, the Austrians in the Balkans, right? Russia, and the British even, and the French, their influence in the Balkans. And Russia's like, uh-oh, we're now losing some of our influence in the region, which we have, of course, taken from the Ottomans. We need to reestablish ourselves, right? And so a big part of that is why Russia was so intent in stepping in to back up Serbia. because they felt they had been sort of threatened one too many times. They had shown weakness one too many times. And this was a moment when they needed to stand firm and show, no, we are still the masters of this region. Okay, you want to come to the Balkans, you got to go through us. And of course, that decision, in part, is what leads to this war erupting, along with a lot of other decisions, of course.
Nicholas II made the position clear when war came. We have now to intercede not only for a related country unjustly attacked, but also to safeguard the honor, dignity, and integrity of Russia and her position among the great powers.
Yeah, highlight the second part. Let's be honest, it's less about honor and dignity, more about Russia's position among the great powers. That's important.
During the war, the now renamed Russian capital of Petrograd claimed German and Austro-Hungarian territory and wanted to prevent Germany from becoming dominant in Europe. Some of this territory might be included in an autonomous Polish kingdom under the Tsar, and they suggested breaking up Austria-Hungary much earlier than any other ally. The Russians also hoped that Serbia would expand at Austria's expense. All this would increase Russian influence in the Balkans. Once the Ottomans joined the Central Powers, Russia aimed for control of Constantinople and the Turkish Straits, which would allow them access to the Mediterranean and give them control over an Orthodox holy city.
And that had been Russia's goal for a long, long time. I mean, you could argue, really, since Russia became Orthodox. Well, not since Russia became Orthodox, because of course at that time Constantinople was itself still Orthodox, but perhaps since the Ottomans had conquered Constantinople, Russia had been interested in taking it back. And now it was seeming more realistic than ever. At least in the sort of 1800s, lead up into the 1900s. You can look at the Crimean War, right, which was a moment when Russia, once again, wanted to really take control of the Balkans, wanted to conquer Constantinople. And in that case, it was the British and French who were like, whoa, let's not do that. Because even though they're going to be allies with Russia in this war, they're not altogether comfortable with Russia's imperial ambitions in this region, because, of course, they want to get in there as well. But that is what Russia wants, right? For a long time, and still at this point, they want to get to Constantinople.
After the February 1917 revolution, the weakness of the provisional government and the influence of the Petrograd Soviet changed Russia's war aims.
Yeah.
The Kerensky government now suggested a negotiated peace without annexations and framed the war as a struggle to preserve the revolution against reactionary Central Powers monarchies.
It's interesting, since Russia goes through a couple of different governments, you can see how these different governments frame this war, right? What is the reason that we're doing this? Of course, the Bolsheviks, who are not yet in power, they straight up want out of the war. They're not trying to frame or propagandize, we should do the war for this, this, or this. They're saying, no, we should get out of the war. And that is what they're going to do, of course, at great cost to their own sort of empire.
When the Bolsheviks overthrew the provisional government in the October Revolution, they wanted peace at any price to consolidate their revolution and focus on the civil war against the counter-revolutionary whites.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of reasons that the Bolsheviks are so interested in backing out this war, right? As they pointed out, some of those reasons are, in a big part, that they needed to consolidate their position, right? I mean, the Bolsheviks are in control of the country at this point, but really there are large swaths of Russia and the surrounding territories which are not controlled by the Bolsheviks, right? They need to consolidate their position. Of course, we're going to be launched into the civil war, which is going to be extremely destructive, right? So they're interested in their sort of domestic affairs, but also the Bolsheviks had gained power on essentially a platform of ending the war. That had been one of their big promises, right? Their slogan was peace, land, and bread. Peace, right? A big part of that, 1/3 of their whole platform, was getting out of this war. So there was a lot of pressure on them to get out of this war as quickly as possible.
France's political and military war aims were mostly about security in the face of a larger, more powerful Germany. Public discussion was limited.
And just to wrap up Russia's war aims, I think you can make a pretty good argument that the war aims of, the Tsarist government, who, was the one who begun this war, not that they started it, but they're the government in power when World War One began, their war goals were not at all achieved, and in fact, the government no longer existed by the end of the conflict. And then for the Bolsheviks, it's almost doesn't make sense to talk about their war goals because their war goal was to get out of the war, right? So Russia didn't really, I'd say, achieve its goals during this war. So far, I'd say these countries are not doing so great. Of course, we've talked about some of the countries who came out looking not so great after this, but I think you can make it the case. And we'll see that even some of the victorious powers had some, difficulties after the conflict. But we'll see what we get to with France and Britain in particular. I guess the US as well.
Security in the face of a larger, more powerful Germany. Public discussion was limited, but in December 1914, President Raymond Poincaré stated France wanted the return of Alsace-Lorraine, Belgian independence, the destruction of Prussian militarism, and a reorganized Europe that would ensure French security.
I think you can make the case that France actually did achieve a lot of those goals in the short term, but that in the long term, they were deeply out of their depth, right? That those goals were really not achieved. And in fact, their actions in this war really came back around to harm them and the whole world in the long run.
Parliamentarians hotly debated territorial claims beyond Alsace-Lorraine. Some, both on the right and center-left, wanted to extend French influence in some form over Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany's Saarland and Rhineland regions. More radical politicians proposed that France support an independent state in the Rhineland or even annex it. A few hardliners proposed breaking up all of Germany into smaller pieces.
We can see here, France had a couple of different war goals, but all of their goals revolve around Germany, right? Germany was the biggest threat to France. France had always been worried about being surrounded by its enemies. Well, of course, since the creation of modern Germany, only a couple of decades prior, France now had a new number one enemy, right? And especially since the Franco-Prussian War, which was one of the wars that allowed Germany to be created, and France had been absolutely destroyed. They really lost quite badly and quite embarrassingly to Prussia and its sort of German forces, right? Since then, France had been interested both in sort of containing Germany, right, to defend themselves, and really in getting back at Germany. They were still pretty spiteful and revenge-oriented after the Franco-Prussian War, and so France, their goals are really oriented around Germany, right? They want to contain and punish Germany, which they end up doing for a short time, once again.
Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau summed up French resolve, equating waging war with achieving war aims. My foreign policy and my home policy are the same. At home, I wage war. Abroad, I wage war. I shall go on waging war. French leaders also wanted to weaken German economic potential in the future, including inter-allied oversight of raw material production in Europe. Some argue...
we saw there that some of these politicians in France wanted an independent sort of Rhineland state. We know that after this war, France is going to, both try to cap Germany's industrial production, but also use it for their own benefit. And France, for a while, is going to occupy that industrial Rhineland, right? So that interest, both in that territory and in Germany's industrial capacity, is very clear in those actions.
For a post-war political union with Belgium and Luxembourg, or a customs union with the Low Countries and Italy, all to secure French influence and security against Germany. What never changed were the objectives to defeat Germany, recover Alsace-Lorraine, and create a new security architecture in Europe. France also developed new imperial ambitions. The Sykes-Pico Agreement of 1916 granted France direct control and a zone of influence in what were then Ottoman lands in the Middle East. But Paris never clearly defined France's goals in the region until after the war. France's late war goals also included future security guarantees from the United States and Britain. American entry into the war, the desire of the French army and people for peace, pressure from the French socialist parties, and the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 all modified French war aims. Without Russian support, they dropped the idea of a Rhenish state or the breakup of Germany. France had not wanted the breakup of Austria-Hungary for fear Germany might gain from it, but when President Wilson insisted, the French pushed for the new states in Central Europe to be as large as possible.
Yes, right? So once again, France is always oriented against Germany. And so with Austria, they don't really care that much. They're saying, hey, we want to keep Austria-Hungary, or if they don't end up existing, which they don't, the resulting states as powerful as possible to try and combat German expansion. Now, of course, that did not work, right? In fact, it did not work pretty disastrously in the interwar period, but that is what France is going for.
To resist potential German influence in the future. There was even talk of a greater Poland, including Lithuania and part of Ukraine. France also wanted close relations with Poland, Czechoslovakia.
Hey, France had been sort of an advocate of Poland for a while. You can think back to the Napoleonic era, when Napoleon himself essentially created a somewhat autonomous Polish state. Of course, in some ways it was a French puppet state, but it was the only state the Poles had since Poland had been partitioned a few decades prior in the late 1700s by Prussia, Austria, and Russia. Right? And so France had always wanted a more autonomous and independent Poland in order to be sort of a bulwark against the surrounding powers, right? Of course, France wants her rivals to be weakened and her to be empowered, so they'd advocated for Poland for a while for that very reason.
Romania, Yugoslavia, and potentially Ukraine to counter Germany. In the end, France recovered Alsace-Lorraine, gained new colonies, and partly weakened Germany, but failed to create a Europe where France was safe, partly because of British resistance.
So I say here, sort of, I think in the short run, when you look at just the war itself and the immediate aftermath, you can make the case that France fulfills a good deal of its war aims. But if we zoom out and we take in the entirety of the interwar period and the beginning of the Second World War, we can see that these achievements for France, they were not long-lasting, they were on a shaky foundation, and that all of this would sort of, reverse in the end, and France would end up more endangered than it had been previously.
In 1914, the British government was divided about joining the war until Germany attacked neutral Belgium. Germany's violation of Belgian sovereignty looked to London like a threat to the international order that it wanted to uphold. If Britain didn't join the war, Germany might become the dominant power in Europe and leave Britain isolated, something politician Sir Edward Grey had worried about as far back as 1911. The moment the weakest powers in Europe were assailed, either by diplomacy or by force, one by one they would appeal to us to help them. If we sat by and looked on and did nothing, then people ought to realize that the result would be one great combination in Europe, outside which we should be left without a friend.
Yeah, so Britain, for a while during particularly the 19th century, they'd had what they called splendid isolation. Sounds very British. And the idea was that, Britain was really dominating the world through imperialism, and they just wanted to be left to their own devices to, conquer more colonies, to make a lot of money, all that sort of stuff. They weren't really that interested in affairs on the continent. Now, of course, Britain was still involved over that time period in alliances, diplomacy, and wars in Europe, right? The Crimean War, which I mentioned a bit earlier. But, they were still, to a certain extent, sort of in their own bubble. Now, as we approach World War I, there's a bit of a change in the British attitude, and they decide, you know what, maybe we should get a bit more involved, we should make some alliances, do some diplomacy. So we've got a Britain here who is more interested now in maintaining a certain order in Europe and keeping certain alliances than they had been a bit previously.
Britain saw the restoration of Belgian independence, reducing German...
Especially, I should note, a part of that was absolutely the rise of Germany, right, which Britain saw as a major threat, right? I mean, this German state emerged onto the scene extremely powerful politically, militarily, and economically. All of that was a threat to Britain. Not to mention, Germany had been building up its navy, which was really a direct threat to Britain, right? So, not the whole, but part of getting Britain more involved in European affairs was the fact they felt so threatened by this new German state.
Britain saw the restoration of Belgian independence, reducing German military and naval power, and limiting German influence in Africa and the Middle East as its primary war aims in 1914. To keep Britain's global empire and maritime trade secure, Germany must not be able to project its power on the high seas.
Exactly.
In 1916, Britain added Imperial Expansion to its goals, with the Sykes-Picot Agreement dividing the Ottoman Middle East with France. Britain's potential new territories in the region would improve the security of the Suez Canal and sea lanes to India, and
yes, and of course, sow a lot of future discord and violence.
Provide more resources, especially oil. British presence in the Middle East would also counter future Russian influence, especially once Russia became a hostile communist power in late 1917. These realpolitik war aims conveniently overlapped with liberal ideas of free trade and the independence and freedom of small nations.
Yeah, funny how that often happens, huh?
We have battled and will continue to battle our hardest for the common cause in Europe. But on behalf of that cause, as well as in defense of our existence, we shall find ourselves compelled to complete the liberation of the Arabs, to make secure the independence of Persia, and, if we can, of Armenia, and to protect tropical Africa from German economic and military exploitation.
Sure, yeah, let's protect Africa. That's what you were doing. I mean, come on.
All these objects are justifiable in themselves and don't become less so because they also increase the general sphere of British influence and afford a strategical security.
So, I mean, they are literally making the point that, it's a real nice coincidence that these two things align. And hey, just because all of these great moral goals also benefit us doesn't mean they're not still good. When, in reality, the argument to make is that, well, perhaps all of these moral goals are only being stated in order to justify the protection and expansion of more material British interests.
During the peace conference, the UK's diplomatic goals shifted to trying to make sure German commerce would partly recover, and that France would not become too dominant in the post-world order. The UK achieved imperial expansion, restored Belgian independence, and eliminated the German fleet and colonial empire. Italy, though, was quite unhappy with its results.
Yeah, I'd say Britain, they did probably better than France in terms of what they gained from the war. Now, once again, of course, we know in the long run we've got the interwar period in World War II, but it's a little, with France, it's like so clearly all drawn back to this moment. True for Britain as well, but you feel like Britain sort of did a little better out of World War I than France did, even in the long run. Though, of course, the Second World War, all of that will end up sort of setting into motion the collapse of the British Empire. But it sort of didn't come back to bite Britain so directly as it did France, who was, of course, quickly conquered and occupied during the Second World War. So, hard to say, but feels like of the nations involved, Britain probably came out as one of the most successful from this conflict.
Italy joined the Allies in 1915, since nationalists wanted to complete the unification of the country that had started in the 19th century. Their position won out over the neutralist and socialist camps, both of whom wanted to keep Italy out of the war. Rome didn't have clear war aims before Italy joined, but its claims soon grew according to the policy known as sacred egoism. Italy wanted Austro-Hungarian territory, not only where Italian speakers lived, but defensible so-called natural borders in the Alps and surrounding the Adriatic.
Just wasn't gonna happen. We've seen a lot of these countries with the territorial ambitions just did not even come close to happening. I think really so far, the only sort of major territorial gains are, of course, to Germany from Brest-Litovsk, and also sort of Britain and France with their further colonial conquests. Now, of course, there were territorial losses and gains here and there. Of course, there were breakups of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, but in terms of, the sort of territorial ambitions that Italy has, most of those did not end up happening.
They also hoped for new imperial conquests in Ottoman Anatolia and in the Aegean, and possibly a deal to expand Italian colonies in Africa in exchange for the British and French taking German colonies elsewhere. Later in the war, Italians debated whether they would be strong enough to protect everything they claimed if they ever received it, especially after the Russian Revolution removed an ally and potential rival.
Yeah.
The threat of a victorious Tsarist Russia influencing Central European Slavs on Italy's doorstep disappeared. And
I mean, if you think about it, Italy never managed to achieve all these territorial gains they were thinking of. But even if they had, can you imagine how stretched thin and weak an Italian state or an Italian empire ruling over these new colonial conquests and new territory would have been? I mean, it would have been a disaster. Not that Italy wasn't already a disaster, but I really don't think it would have worked.
a potential Yugoslav state became the new challenge. Prime Minister Vittorio Orlando saw an opportunity. When Imperial Russia's triumph was a possibility, with the immense influence it would have gained over the Slavs of Austria and the Balkans, which would have become one of its branches to the Adriatic and the Mediterranean, taking territorial precautions could be justified. Not today. Today, the Slavs of Austria, the Serbs, the Yugoslavs are very disheartened. They feel they've lost their ancient and powerful protector and look to us.
Do they?
If we know how to handle things and we offer them friendship, our prestige in the alliance as the main protectors of their cause will increase after the Russian protection has failed. But the more aggressive camp led by Foreign Minister Sidney Sonnino or extreme nationalists like Gabriele D'Annunzio won out, and Italy retained its early war goals, supported the complete dismemberment of Austria-Hungary, and clashed with the Yugoslavs over territorial claims at the peace conference. When the peace treaties were signed, Italy gained less territory than Rome had expected. Its relations with Yugoslavia were poor, and it was racked by social unrest.
Yeah, Italy is one of those interesting cases, like Japan, and I wonder if we'll talk about Japan in this video. We should. Who they were on the winning side of the war, and they did gain, but they did not gain nearly as much as they wanted, and they were sorely, sorely disappointed. And that set both of these nations on a path towards political radicalization, and of course these far-right nationalist movements, right? Of course, there were a couple other countries, particularly Germany, set on that path, but Germany lost the war, right? They lost. Their Treaty of Versailles really badly punished them, right? That sets them on this path eventually towards Nazi Germany. Whereas Italy and Japan, well, they're on the winning side, and yet they still end up on a similar trajectory because they are so let down by the outcomes of this treaty.
It temporarily also gained territory in Anatolia, which it quickly gave up in the face of Turkish resistance and instability at home. The United States entered the war in April 1917 with political and ideological objectives, to protect its own security and to remake the international order. Many Americans saw the Central Powers' actions as a direct threat to U.S. safety. Beyond the U.S. lives and property lost to German U-boats when the U.S. was still neutral, the infamous Zimmermann telegram, in which Germany proposed an alliance with Mexico against the U.S., caused Washington to see Germany as a real threat. And if the Central Powers won the war, that might mean a worrying German presence in what the US saw as its backyard. A peace settlement might have seen the Germans make claims for territory or bases in French or British possessions in the Caribbean, South America, or even Canada. So one US war aim was to eliminate this potential danger, since Washington feared if they stayed neutral, a Central Powers victory could prove dangerous. The most well-known US war aim was to reimagine an international order based on democracy, free trade, and self-determination.
Yeah, and of course this whole involvement, which is very much centered around Woodrow Wilson, is still, I would argue, pretty controversial today, in part because of the figure of Woodrow Wilson himself, who is not remembered very fondly as a president, and not rated very highly, including by me. I'm not a fan of the man. A very controversial character. And so this sort of involvement in the war ends up being pretty controversial as well. I mean, not to mention that Wilson lays out his points in the League of Nations. America doesn't even end up joining the League of Nations due to opposition from Congress, right? And Wilson himself was this very sort of ideological character who had these great, ambitious ideological war aims that were in some ways sort of out of step, his sort of 14 points, out of step with what was actually happening on the ground in Europe and around the world. And so his sort of vision, though parts of it do happen, his vision really does not come to life in the following years. Once again, we see what the result of all of this is. So I'd say that doesn't really come to fruition. Now, America's goals in terms of tending to its own security and its own sort of economic interests, I would argue those go pretty well for the United States, right? I mean, look, World War II is what really leaves America as the dominant superpower, competing with the Soviets, but World War I is the step in that process where America gets more involved, the economy is sort of juiced up, becomes far more of an international player than it already was. And remember, though, there's this sort of thing about complete American isolation. Then it sort of opened up by this conflict. But America was already an international player at this point. They'd been very involved for a while in many different international affairs and treaties and diplomacy and all this sort of stuff. But the First World War is a step in that direction, and definitely a step towards America as this global superpower.
The new system would be upheld by the League of Nations, which President Wilson wanted to create as part of the peace settlement. At first, Wilson called for peace without victory and saw the root problem of the international system and the cause of the war as imperialism and autocracy. But partly because of the harsh terms of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in 1918, Wilson became convinced that Germany had to be weakened. However, in contrast to the British and French, he still wanted Germany to quickly recover and join the post-war League of Nations. Wilson's advisor, Colonel House, hoped that the League of Nations would guarantee peace with Germany. If, after establishing the League, we are so stupid as to let Germany train and arm a large army and again become a menace to the world, we would deserve the fate which such folly would bring upon us.
Well,
in the end, the US achieved its own security goals by contributing to the defeat of the Central Powers, but did not achieve Wilson's international vision and did not join the League of Nations.
It just wasn't going to happen. I'm not really quite sure what Wilson was going for. Maybe I have to read up more on the man and his goals myself. But like I said, it seems to me a sort of policy prescription or a policy platform that was just really out of step with what reality was, right? His 14 points, all these things, they were just not going to really work in reality. Now, of course, they certainly had an influence. I won't dispute that. And like I said, some of his ideas came more true than others, but overall, his vision for a post-war Europe and a post-war world just didn't really shape up the way he'd imagined it.
So while it's often said that the First World War was fought for nothing, historically speaking, this wasn't the case for the countries who fought it. They all had distinct war aims, some moral, some expansionist, and some defensive, which changed and evolved over the course of the war. What they did not know is that both victors and vanquished would be forming new war aims just 20 years later. And unlike 1918, the Second World War in Europe wouldn't end with a controversial treaty, but only with unconditional surrender of Germany in May 1945. In the final weeks of the war, the Red Army launched a massive offensive from the banks of the Oder River to take Berlin, the capital of Nazi Germany, where its leader, Adolf Hitler, was holding out in his bunker. The Battle of Berlin is one of the biggest battles in history, but often overlooked in classic World War II
moving into an advertisement?
That's why we produced the most detailed documentary ever about the final assault on Berlin. With a total runtime of over 4 hours, our documentary series 16 Days in Berlin follows the battle day by day, featuring detailed maps, infographics, authentic combat footage, expert interviews, and much more. Due to the uncompromising portrayal of the Second World War, we cannot upload this documentary to YouTube. So where can you watch 16 Days in Berlin?
Let us know.
On Nebula.
Yeah, I'll link their video down below. I was waiting for the ad part. I'll link their video down below. You can go and check it out. I'm surprised we didn't talk about Japan, right? I consider them one of the major nations involved in the war. I mentioned this earlier. I'd say their case was a similar one to Italy's in some ways. I guess Japan actually saw more military success, I would argue. Though they were less, of course, involved in the European theater of the conflict, right? Japan set out to make colonial and territorial gains, and though they received some of those, they were disappointed by the way things had gone, so sort of partial fulfillment of their goals, and a disappointment that led them on the road to radicalism and far-right nationalism, much like Italy, right? So they're in a sort of similar position. Yeah, an interesting video. Like I said in the beginning, I still stand by the idea that, it's not that World War I was fought for nothing. It's just that, the variety of goals it was fought for absolutely did not justify the bloodshed. And to be honest, I think that's what people are getting at when they say it was fought for nothing. I think sort of the feeling they're getting at is that look at how many lives were lost, and then look at what was achieved. It's extremely disproportionate, right? If you sort of laid out what was gained from this war, you absolutely would not be willing to purchase it with millions and millions of lives lost. But that, in effect, is what happened. Of course, it was not such a simple transaction, right? As we've said, all these different nations and interest groups within different nations had a lot of different goals, a lot of different motivations. All of that came together in one very complicated conflict. And we saw a lot of that today. So yeah, some really interesting stuff. If you guys enjoyed this one, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon, which is linked down below, and I'll give you access to exclusive reaction content. With all of that, I hope you're all having a fantastic day today, and I'll see you all again next time. Goodbye.